Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion focusing on the political implications and global repercussions of the war on Iran. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar. As you all know, the current war began on February 28 when the United States and Israel launched large-scale strikes on Iran, targeting military assets and killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, along with several senior political and military officials. Iran responded with missile and drone attacks against Israel and U.S. military bases, as well as civilian infrastructures across the region. Tehran also targeted key oil and gas facilities in the Gulf states and disrupted shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes, which triggered a broader regional security crisis and significant disruptions to global energy supplies. While the US and Israeli officials have offered varying explanations for the war, ranging from ending Iran's nuclear program to weakening its missile capabilities and pursuing regime change, the broader objectives of the campaign and its post-war vision remain unclear. The conflict has since expanded across multiple fronts, especially in Lebanon, where Israel responded to Hezbollah's attacks with heavier strikes across southern Lebanon and Beirut's southern suburbs, in addition to ground operations killing hundreds of people, ordering evacuations of millions, and triggering a fresh wave of displacements in Lebanon. And we've seen major escalation over the past few days, especially yesterday, beginning with the targeting of the U.S. hitting the Khark Island, which is Iran's main oil export hub. We've seen Israel attacking the South Pars gas field, which is jointly managed by Iran and Qatar, and is the biggest source of domestic energy in Iran. These escalations targeting energy facilities are very significant. Iran retaliated, similarly launched attacks on energy sites in the Gulf, hitting Qatar's main gas facility at Ras Laffan, two Saudi refineries, the UAE's Habshan gas facilities and the Bab oil field, and some energy sites in Kuwait as well. Further angering Gulf states, we've seen the Saudi foreign minister noting that Saudi Arabia retains the right to respond to Iranian attacks, essentially putting military action on the table. These escalations are now disrupting energy production, not just shipping, and could have impacts on energy markets and the global economy for years to come. On his part, Trump posted that the US was not aware of the Israeli attack on the South Pars gas field. And we can talk about whether that is true or not. But this could signal yet another break between Trump and Netanyahu with regard to this war. We are now in the third week of the war, with hundreds of people killed, millions displaced, billions of dollars spent, and risks of a global recession looming. According to some reports, more than 1,500 people were killed in Iran, including more than 200 children. Over 900 were killed in Lebanon, 58 in Iraq, at least 20 in the Gulf states, 14 in Israel, 3 Palestinian women in the West Bank yesterday, and 13 US service members. Here in the United States, tensions have been rising as the Trump administration continues to issue conflicting statements on US military objectives and the trajectory of the war. On one hand, Trump launched the war without seeking authorization from US Congress, but the American public is increasingly against the war, with nearly 60% disapproving. And the costs for the Americans are growing. The US spent up to $22 billion by now on this war, and there are reports that the Pentagon has requested 200 additional billions from the White House Gas prices are rising, along with the risk of worsening inflation. And as I said, 13 US service members have been killed so far. We've been seeing also a discrepancy between the White House and the intelligence community on the motivation behind the war and whether Iran posed a real threat. With recently the Trump administration's top counterterrorism official being the first to resign over the Iran war. So in light of these many unfolding and serious developments, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is organizing this webinar to examine the ongoing US-Israel war and its regional and global implications. So many developments. We have a lot of questions, but we are very fortunate to have with us today an excellent panel of experts to address these important issues. I will begin by introducing all of the panelists in speaking order. Youssef Munayyer is the head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Barbara Slavin is the distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. Sina Tusi is senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. Giorgio Cafayero is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. And Negar Mortazavi, who might be joining us a little later, is an Iranian-American journalist and political analyst and the editor and host of the Iran podcast. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to contribute to this discussion. We appreciate your time and contributions. I will be giving each one of you about 10 to 12 minutes to answer some questions and present your remarks. And then we'll have about 30 minutes left for discussion and questions from the audience. Before we start, I'd like to remind our audience that you can send in your questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And for those who are watching on social media or our website, you can send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. We will try to take as many questions as time allows. And with that, we will begin the discussion. I would like to start with Youssef and trying to understand the Israeli rationale and politics. Youssef, what is Israel's motivation and objectives behind starting this war, and how does Israeli politics play into it? And there are a lot of questions about what made President Trump join Israel in this war, and what made him susceptible to Netanyahu's pressure. Is Israel effectively running U.S. foreign policy? Youssef, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Yeah, we'll touch on a number of those things and more, and try to keep it to the required time. I think the first thing that's important for people to understand is that what we are seeing today is part of Israel's vision for the region. And when I say this, I want people to understand that this is something that has been in the works for a very long time. And it is in part a product of the very predicament that Israel finds itself in by the very nature of what Israel is, a state in the region that has essentially imposed its will on the region against the will and the desire of the people in the region, which has created a necessary set of adversarial relationships with everyone around it. Now, Israel can seek stability and security through a couple of different pathways, given this reality. One would be the pathway of seeking some kind of compromise and peace, both with the Palestinians and by extension, those around it. And the other pathway is, of course, one that doesn't seek peace, but instead seeks a perpetual war footing. Whatever one can say about the past in terms of Israel's approach to its neighbors and to the Palestinians in particular, what is clear today, I think, beyond a doubt, is that there is no interest whatsoever and no hope from the perspective of Israel in achieving some sort of peace with the Palestinians. And they have their own rationale for this. But what is very clear is that's simply not on the agenda. And so, how then does Israel seek to achieve stability and security in a situation where it is going to have permanent adversarial relationships with much of its neighbors, in a neighborhood where, of course, there are hundreds of millions of people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians, and where the Palestinian issue continues to be a central one in the region? This then requires that Israel be on a perpetual war footing. And this is one of the reasons why in recent years we've seen a continued expansion both of Israeli power projection, the extent to which it is willing to engage in conflict, and how open-ended so many of the conflicts in which Israel engages are. Previously, even though it has been essentially understood that a perpetual war footing would be necessary in Israel, it has had, I would argue, a slightly different approach based on what the kind of capabilities available to it and the geostrategic situation in the region are. These things have changed in recent years. Previously, I think the Israeli approach has been primarily to achieve a set of deterrent relationships with various adversaries. And we've seen this in Israel's activities in Lebanon, vis-a-vis Gaza, in Syria, and in recent years, Iran as well. But I think what has changed now is that the calculus from Israel's perspective is no longer about achieving deterrence in these relationships, but instead achieving hegemony throughout the region. And this is something that has become possible in recent years, again, because of geostrategic developments, because of advancements in Israeli capabilities, and also because both under the Biden administration and the Trump administration, the United States has not only been willing to support the Israeli military, its independent sort of military industries, but it's also been willing in an unprecedented way, again, under both administrations, to effectively loan the strength and the cover of the American military behind Israeli military aims, something that's allowed the Israelis to think much bigger in terms of what they're able to do throughout the region than ever before. So this is where we are in terms of Israel's vision for the region and how this fits into this moment. It's part of an effort to establish Israeli hegemony throughout the region, which has not been the case before. This has also, in Netanyahu's own words, been his dream for the past 40 years. I think this is very important to point out. He has made 7 different trips to the White House since Donald Trump has come in to the White House. This has not been because Netanyahu seeks to consult on the designs for the new White House ballroom. This has been because this Israeli prime minister sees in this American president a rare opportunity to achieve the dream that he has long held for the past 40 years, which was to essentially use the American military as part of his objectives in taking out the regime in Iran. But I think it's important for us to ask, if this has been Netanyahu's dream for 40 years, why is it only happening now? I would argue that this is the product of several windows that have been closing, and it's not the window around Iran's nuclear achievements, which the Israeli prime minister has long been talking about for the past 3 decades or so, constantly telling the world that Iran is on the cusp of a nuclear weapon. Of course, we know from the American president who carried out strikes on several Iranian nuclear sites last year, that in his words, the Iranian nuclear program was obliterated. Instead, the windows that I think have been closing now for Israel and for Netanyahu in particular are related to the fact that this president is who he is, who has been more willing to go along with Israeli designs than I think any before him. Netanyahu has tried to get previous American administrations to go along with this unsuccessfully, and he understands that in Donald Trump, he has a very rare partner. There is also the closing window, the political window, for Donald Trump and for Benjamin Netanyahu in the fact that there are elections in the United States and in Israel, which are scheduled this year. Midterm elections, of course, here in America, and elections in Israel that should take place no later than this fall, which hold in the balance the fate of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, of course, has been able to evade responsibility in Israel so far for presiding over the security catastrophe that was the attacks of October 7th. And so this window of time for sort of political immunity for both of these decision makers is limited and closing in part because of this. It's also closing, I believe, because American public opinion has shifted decidedly away from support for Israel, particularly over the last few years, and is only continuing to trend in that direction. Because of both these things, the political space for carrying out these kind of strikes was shrinking. And if it was not going to happen in this period of time, Netanyahu's dream for 40 years may not be achievable at a later moment. It's also important to note that the military dynamics dictated a certain timeline as well. I think one of the things that we learned from the American and Israeli attacks on Iran last year is that there's a certain numbers game at play, both in terms of the projectiles that Iran can launch in the case of any kind of conflict, and the number of defense interceptors that both Israel, the United States, and its allies throughout the region are able to bring to bear. And over a period of time, the ability of Iran to produce projectiles would be much faster than the ability of the United States and its allies to recoup defense interceptors. And so there too is a window there that was likely closing as well. I want to point out here that there are also very different war aims, I think, between the United States and Israel. I want to identify that what Netanyahu wants out of this is not necessarily what Donald Trump wants out of this. And while that may not have been immediately apparent at the beginning of this war, it has become increasingly apparent as we have moved further into it. What Netanyahu wants out of this war, I think, is very simple. It's regime change or bust. And by bust, I mean busting up the Iranian state as we know it. So I think the Israelis would be content if there is, of course, a new regime in Iran that is more friendly towards Israel. But short of that, I think they would also be happy to see a collapse of this regime, instability, chaos, and even civil war in Iran for years to come. It fits this agenda of extending Israeli hegemony by weakening the strongest opposition to it in the region. But importantly, I think Netanyahu also needs some sort of conclusive victory that resets the region for a long time. You have to understand that for Israel, the last several years have been, I think, more challenging than ever before in terms of what the Israeli home front has been experiencing. Netanyahu is putting forward this vision of perpetual war that calls on Israeli society to bear significant costs and sacrifices. He needs to be able to show a light at the end of the tunnel. He needs to be able to provide for the Israeli public an answer to, well, what happens next? That is not just another generation of Israelis will be signing up for perpetual war as they have seen over the last several years. What Donald Trump wants, though, is, I think, something different. He wants a short, low-cost campaign where he can point to some sort of triumph and walk away. Now, there may have been an overlap between these two sets of aims, particularly at the outset of this campaign, and I believe the Israelis sold this campaign to Donald Trump with the idea that there would be a quick victory here with some sort of regime change that would follow a decapitation strike that would lead to sort of a mass uprising in the streets and quickly bring a conclusion to this effort. That's not what played out. Iran, of course, did not cooperate with those aims. We have not seen the mass uprising. And despite what seems to be quite effective decapitation strikes, the Iranian regime has shown resilience and the ability to continue to impose costs over time. Now, as this has gone on, the gaps between the United States and Israel have continued to emerge. We've seen the president of the United States say things like, well, we had some alternative leaders in mind, but they keep ending up dead, referring to the fact that the Israelis seem to be eliminating any potential Venezuela options in Iran that would give Trump his sort of quick pivoting point. We also have seen Israeli strikes that have targeted both oil and gas infrastructure in Iran, which is a major escalation. And this is something that the United States, both when it came to the targeting of the oil depots outside of Iran, and most recently the targeting of gas infrastructure in the Pars field, has spoken out against, precisely because of the kind of dangerous escalation that it has led to. There is no clear end in sight here. The Iranian regime has been battered, but it's shown resilience and an ability to still impose costs over time, growing costs over time with global impact. We haven't seen that mass uprising. And even if there was one, it's unclear what direction it would take. A Western-friendly democracy is probably the least likely outcome, and protracted bloody conflict is much more probable. Energy prices, of course, are skyrocketing and will have multiple downstream effects impacting all sectors of the global economy. In sum, what we are witnessing now is something of a death triangle where there are three different forces maybe pulling against each other: the Iranian regime's will to survive, Netanyahu's nefarious hegemonic aims, and Donald Trump's ego. Hanging in the balance is the future of the region and the entire global economy. At some point, something's got to give. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Yusuf, for this comprehensive assessment of Israeli objectives, but also the conflicting objectives between among Israel, between Israel and the US, but also considering Iranian objectives as well. Next, I'd like to move to Barbara. Yusuf mentioned that there might be a gap in the aims between Trump and Netanyahu. And Yusuf outlined what are the calculations in Israel and in Netanyahu's mind. But what is the Trump administration strategy and approach, if there is one, Barbara? And what do you make of the contradictions in the administration statements about Iran, different members of the administration? Is there an exit strategy? How could Trump end this war? And we all know he wants to claim victory. How could he end this war and also be able to claim victory? Or is there another way to, or another exit strategy? And what is the role of US Congress and US public opinion here? Is it big enough to have an impact on the administration? Barbara, you have 12 minutes.
Okay, I'll probably try to be briefer than that. First of all, thanks for having me. I agree with a lot of what Yusuf said. I thought maybe just some interesting background. Netanyahu was first elected prime minister of Israel, I believe, in 1996. And that was in response, first of all, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish terrorist, but also Hamas terrorist attacks, suicide bombings that killed Israelis on buses and in other public places. And of course, Iran supported Hamas. So I think we need to keep in mind that this is a long time adversarial relationship, that Iran has supported many groups that have threatened Israel and Israelis. So it's not an imagined adversarial relationship. In the United States, we've seen a regurgitation of all the grievances going back 47 years to the hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981, when The new Islamic Republic of Iran took American diplomats hostage and held them for 444 days. All of this baggage being trotted out. But that said, yeah, there are differences, there are overlaps, but there are also differences, I think, between the US and Israel in terms of aims. One of the main things that's emerged since this war started is the lack of foresight by Donald Trump in particular about what the ramifications of the war would be. He envisioned something relatively short and surgical, like the June War, or like his exfiltration of the president of Venezuela, something that would not cause very many American casualties and certainly would not cause the economic pain that we're seeing because of the oil price and so on. Now, there's a question about how well he was briefed. We had a hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday where the director of national intelligence actually did not read the script that was in front of her, in which it said that there was essentially no imminent threat from Iran, that at least in the nuclear field, Iran was not attempting to reconstitute its uranium enrichment program after the June war. She left that out. And only under questioning from an American senator, John Ossoff, was it revealed that yes, this was in the text of the intelligence briefing. Trump makes up his own rules. He makes up his own facts. This has, of course, terrible effects when he doesn't appear to foresee that a war like this was always going to lead to very serious consequences, economic and otherwise. But the positive side is that at any point, Trump can say, okay, that's it, and declare victory. He can rattle off the number of Iranian leaders killed, the number of missile sites, launchers, production sites, drone sites destroyed. He talks a lot about how the US has already sunk the Iranian Navy, which is not exactly the most important part of the Iranian military. So he can produce a narrative of victory at any point. But one real concern I have now is the fixation on the Strait of Hormuz. Again, he should have been told, he apparently was told, that Iran could quite easily choke off the Strait of Hormuz, through which, 20% of the world's oil passes, or used to pass. He chose to ignore that. As a result, the strait is effectively closed to all but tankers and ships approved by Iran. So oil is flowing now to China and to some others, but has been largely stopped otherwise. And Trump has been railing at the Europeans for not coming to his rescue, or China not coming to his rescue and reopening the strait, as though this were not a logical consequence of the war that he and Bibi Netanyahu started. So I'm afraid that there will have to be some sort of agreement or strategy on largely reopening the strait for Trump now to be able to declare victory. He's going to have to be able to reverse the consequence of the war, this important consequence of the war, in order to say that he has somehow succeeded. Now, you pointed out that the war is not popular in the United States. It's definitely not. And as the price of gasoline goes up and up, it becomes even less popular. There's a lot of consternation about the sense that if the US wasn't tricked into this by Israel, it somehow has been brought along by Bibi into supporting an Israeli strategy that's not necessarily in US interests. And you pointed out there was a man named Joe Kent, who was head of the counterterrorism section, a controversial figure, conspiracy theorist, and a known anti-Semite, but nevertheless, someone who is the first in the Trump camp to bail and say this war was a very bad idea, and we should not have gotten into it. If it continues, it's possible we may see more defections. We already have people like Tucker Carlson and others who've not supported this war and who've been predicting for years that a US war on Iran would boomerang and not succeed in terms of whatever objectives that are set. So we remain confused there. As you pointed out, no no vote in Congress authorizing this war, no hearings with senior officials coming and publicly explaining what the United States rationale and endgame is, only private briefings that are then described to the extent possible by senators coming out of meetings to journalists, and shifting rationales given by Donald Trump in various short interviews, no speech from him at the beginning or even now laying out the rationale or the ends. It looks like this will obviously continue for a while longer. I still think that the economic pressures, as they continue to mount, will finally act as a check. And then at some point, I was on a panel with Sina the other week for the National Iranian American Council, and I predicted that when the price of oil went to $150 a barrel and the Dow Jones sank to 40,000, that Trump would call it quits. I hope we will see an end to this long before we reach those numbers. But I think it will have to be concrete economic pain felt in the United States as well as globally that will cause Trump to finally tell Bibi, that's it, you've had your chance, no more, and we will have some sort of uneasy ceasefire. If I may, one other point, and that is I think the impact of the Gaza war and the escalation that followed that. Israel and Iran had been involved in a shadow war for more than a decade. Israel had been assassinating Iranian scientists, there were cyber attacks and so on. But what really triggered this descent into open warfare was when Israel killed a couple of IRGC generals in Damascus in the spring of 2024, and then Iran retaliated for the first time directly against Israel with missile strikes. And this is when the war broke out into the open. And so in a way, I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks was predictable. Once Iran made the decision to no longer just accept the assassination of its senior leaders, I think the die was cast. And I'll leave it there to leave time for my very capable panelists to agree or disagree as they choose.
Thank you, Barbara, for this. And you mentioned at the end there the what is known as Iranian strategy of strategic patience, which seems to have run out. And with that, we move to Sina Tusi, who will give us the view from Iran. Sina, if you could tell us a little bit more about the approach of the Iranian regime. Why does the US and Israel continue to fail to understand what the Iranians are going to do in retaliation? But also, what options does the Iranian regime have at this time? And one more thing, just considering the recent events yesterday and the targeting of energy facilities, what is the strategic rationale in Iran behind attacking neighboring Gulf states? What would it take for the Iranian regime to get back to talks? We've seen some reports about that recently as well. Sina, go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you for all those excellent questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Yes, you touched on the major important shift that has happened where Iran had this kind of implicit strategy that was dubbed strategic patience for many years, especially since the US left the Obama era nuclear deal when Trump left it in his first term in 2018, reimposed these severe economic sanctions on Iran's economy, and really tried to, it was really a regime change policy, more or less, in his first term. Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State, John Bolton as his National Security Advisor, more or less made that clear. The negotiations went nowhere. There was very maximalist demands, and that really, brought us to this juncture. But in, Iran's calculation with this strategic patience policy was, they didn't begin breaching the terms of the Obama era nuclear deal, the JCPOA, until a year after the US left and imposed these very severe economic sanctions. They were hoping they can work with the Europeans to get economic benefits. And then they began very gradually increasing it. and then demonstrating also their capabilities in the region. I remember in their first term, in Trump's first term, then Iranian President Hassan Rouhani would always say, if we can export oil, it does, then that's going to affect the ability of the region to export oil. Basically, Iran's strategy has been that if it will raise the costs for exclusion of it. It will raise the costs for efforts to isolate and marginalize or collapse it or do regime change, and it's had a lot of leverage. But regardless, this strategic patience policy where Iran responded in kind of fairly restrained ways, but calibrated, nevertheless, a demonstration of capability. Even we saw, in 2019, in September 2019, for example, there was a strike on Saudi Aramco, which has been attributed to various actors, but it seems like by all accounts, it was very much Iran ultimately behind that strike that took off half of Saudi oil production in one blow. There was a series of strikes on tankers. I don't know, people aren't forgetting this, but in 2019, initially, and we saw that, for example, when it came to Iran's capabilities to hit targets in the region, after the assassination of Soleimani, Iran hit the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq, and according to reporting that came out afterwards, satellite imagery, it largely destroyed the base. Everything from helicopters there, hangars, communication towers, all of these targets were hit, according to this 60 Minutes documentary I remember about it. And then, fast forward, you did have consolidation of hardliner power in Iran. You had Iran massively expand its breaches of the JCPOA and expand its nuclear program. Meanwhile, it was pursuing negotiations. This held through the Biden era, where Biden came to office saying he wanted to return to the JCPOA, but then this idea really took hold in Washington, including amongst Democrats and the Biden's national security team, that Iran is weak, that this maximum pressure gave us leverage, and that we should try to get more out of Iran, more for more, a longer deal, a stronger deal. These kind of things were said. Ultimately, Biden was not able to resuscitate the nuclear deal. Iran continued to expand its nuclear program, which was its key bargaining chip, its stockpile of enriched uranium, going to higher levels of enrichment, but again, never making the decision to build the bomb. And this was ultimately, a lot of people are talking now about these assassinations in Iran. Who are they assassinating? What effect will they have on Iranian calculations? Khamenei was ultimately someone, when it came to the nuclear program, was kind of a moderating force, where he was against weaponization. He did have this fatwa barring weaponization. And he ultimately, I think what we can say was that he viewed it as a bargaining chip to give, expand this nuclear program, give it away in exchange for some kind of strategic settlement with the US and Europe for the Islamic Republic as this kind of revolutionary power that came into being in 1979, has tried to, carve out its own sphere of influence and strategic depth in the region. Regardless, that strategy did not pay off. We see that Trump engaged in rounds of negotiations with Iran, both ahead of the June war last year and ahead of this war, which now, we have more and more reporting, more and more sources saying that these were going nowhere. The US wasn't really serious. It's unclear to what extent, even, for example, there was a deal on the table just before this war, in which Oman was mediating these negotiations. That deal was stronger than the Obama era deal. That deal, according to British intermediaries who were also there, that it was a deal that Iran was apparently willing to accept even some of these limitations in perpetuity, which, in arms control agreements, there's always sunset clauses. Many people found the sunset clauses of the JCPOA to be one of its key flaws. Regardless, Iran was willing to go above and beyond that. But it seems like, Jared Kushner and Donald and Steve Witkoff were his main interlocutors with Iran. These are figures, it seems like they are, in many ways more Israeli than the Israelis themselves. I mean, Jared Kushner is basically like a relative of Netanyahu, a close family friend. He would tell stories about when Netanyahu would visit them in New York, Netanyahu would sleep in his bedroom and he would go sleep on the couch or something. So just to give you a context, and then this British intermediary who was at these talks recently, wrote in the Guardian that they were really pursuing Israel's interests, not the US interests. And Trump is ultimately someone who, in his decision-making capacity, he really has all of the textbook flaws that a leader can have for poor decision-making. He's surrounded by yes men. He's surrounded by sycophants. These people kind of bend over backwards. You can see it in his cabinet meetings when he's with his secretaries. It's like, Kim Jong-un style. They're bending over backwards to praise him, to say everything's going great. If anyone says anything negative, they risk being fired, they risk being marginalized. So you could see how this decision to attack Iran was not rational. I mean, I think Iran, some people are saying, oh, Iran's deterrence was weakened. It proved it had no deterrence. I don't know. I mean, it hit these targets over the years. It proved it can hit them. It was restrained, but it proved it can hit Israel. It proved it can circumvent the multi-layered air defenses. It proved it can deplete these interceptors. Again, it hit tankers. It hit U.S. bases. And the regime remained cohesive and whatnot. But regardless, this narrative and perception took hold that it's weak. It's a paper tiger. And I think for Trump, if he's surrounded by yes men, he's got the Israelis in his ear, and Netanyahu's probably, has been, he came here on New Year's Eve. He's been here multiple times. He came here again just before the war. I'm sure was telling him all these things, this is going to be great. It's going to be like Venezuela. You're going to take him out. There's going to be a revolution, uprising. And none of that has happened, as Yusuf and others have said, that opening blow, they took out Khamenei. That actually, in many ways, played into the Islamic Republic's ideology and kind of in Shia Islam more broadly about, martyrdom and these ideas where, Khamenei was apparently killed with his family, his granddaughter, these kind of things. And what that did immediately trigger was that the Islamic Republic's base, that I think it's very important that whether we like it or not, that this regime that has shed so much legitimacy since 1979, no doubt about that. And I would argue probably, majority of Iranians want fundamental change. Regardless, it still has a social base. And, it's more of a base than like Saddam Hussein had in 2003 or Muammar Gaddafi had in 2011. And, they've been in the streets and they've been very much radicalized. And there's no signs of defections or splintering among the government itself. And so it's chosen this strategy of, closing the Strait of Hormuz, which is in Iranian military planning, very much publicly stated, even leading up to this war, both in terms of the military doctrine was explicitly changed about a month before. Iran wrote a letter to the UN saying that it would target regional targets, that a war against Iran would, and the Khamenei himself said a war against Iran would become a regional war. So this was all to be expected. So, Trump has said multiple times that they're surprised. They didn't think it was going to be a regional war. They didn't think Iran was going to hit back. But I mean, the GCC states and the Gulf states are basically bystanders to this conflict between the US and Iran and Israel and Iran. And that, Iran has targeted them because that is ultimately where it has leverage. That when it comes to incurring costs and imposing costs in the United States for this war and getting them to kind of back off and agree to some kind of negotiated settlement, that's where they have leverage. So I saw the Omani foreign minister, interestingly, wrote an op-ed in The Economist yesterday where he said Iran's retaliatory strikes were rational. So I'm not going to say, I don't know, but that's what he said. It's interesting. That's probably not the view in all the GCC. But regardless, the Strait of Hormuz is very narrow. At its narrowest point where these ships can pass, it's about 2 miles, I've heard, actually, with the shallow water or the water that's deep enough for these big tankers to actually go through. So very easy for Iran to disrupt, even if it takes massive blows. And then it's been hitting a lot of U.S. military installations in the Persian Gulf and beyond, as well as energy installations initially. So Iran this time went much higher on the escalation ladder than it had in previous rounds immediately. But then it's kind of been seemingly holding there. And then in retaliation to strikes against it, it's been going one rung higher on the escalation ladder. So, we saw that the U.S. has actually, I think this has had some deterrent effect on the U.S. because, Iran is exporting more oil now than it was before the war. Kharg Island, where a lot of Iran's, its main oil export terminal, it was attacked, but military sites there were attacked, which is, it's a very small island. It's unclear what military infrastructure there even was there. I'm sure there was some, but regardless, Trump was very careful not to hit the actual facilities. And now today, Treasury Secretary Bessent is saying that Iranian oil that is on the seas currently, of which there's like 150 million barrels apparently, sanctions are going to be lifted on them. So Iran is in this strategic situation where its goal was to gain some kind of strategic accommodation for years, again, with the nuclear program, with all kinds of things. And, through diplomacy and through all of that, it didn't work ultimately. Now, its push has come to shove. And in this military conflict, Iran is pursuing that same equation that I would argue it's the Islamic Republic has always pursued, which again is a strategic accommodation and a new regional equilibrium. And so with this demonstration of capability over the Strait of Hormuz, what direction this war takes, I think, Trump is in an escalation trap where if he digs in deeper, he's just going to get in a deeper hole that's going to be harder to get out of. So if he wants to send, for example, Israelis, for example, have been going higher and higher on the escalation ladder, and Iran has been retaliating at higher levels in response to that. So they hit the South Pars gas field yesterday. Iran hit targets in Qatar, the main Qatari gas field, Saudi facilities. Today, apparently, the Haifa refinery was just hit, and according to Israeli media, which was also hit in the last June war that knocked it out for a couple months. And so this is just going to continue to accumulate these economic costs of the closure of the strait, of the damage to the oil infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And, this could be for many years already. The damage has been done. It's going to, people are saying it's going to be hard for these facilities to be reconstituted in the near term, for them to meet all the obligations that they had. So this has been a strategically disastrous war, poorly thought out, already many signs of blowback, and no easy off-ramps. I mean, Ali Larijani, who was assassinated, the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, was ultimately a more pragmatic figure who can help build consensus in the Iranian system. Him being assassinated is not going to make an off-ramp or negotiations impossible, but perhaps more difficult, I would argue, depending on who his replacement is. And then, again, hitting these facilities yesterday, Iran has hit back hard. Now, Trump, again, he tweeted yesterday his first arguably kind of negative reaction to Israel in that tweet he put out last night, criticizing this attack, trying to distance the U.S. from, having hit the South Pars oil field, and saying no more attacks on the oil facilities. And Iran this morning, Pezeshkian, the president, as well as the foreign minister Araghchi, have seemingly also echoed that they're not going to escalate more against energy facilities if their energy facilities haven't been attacked. But Iran, I think the dynamics on the Strait of Hormuz are in its favor. As long as that is closed, the global economic cost continues to increase. That is just going to be its leverage increasing over time. And then it can keep up these ballistic missile strikes. It can keep up these drone strikes, which are interestingly, have actually gone upwards in the past 2-3 days. So, it's a fight between the U.S. going after these launchers. I mean, the ballistic missiles, it seems like, are launched both from launchers that are mobile launchers that give off a trace on radar and other sensors. And the U.S. has been hunting them down. Some of them, there's videos that they come out from underground silos. But Iran is a big country, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, from the Central Asia to the Middle East. And so, and they've been preparing for this war for decades. Like, we've been talking about the tunnel infrastructure of Hamas in Gaza, or the tunnel infrastructure of Hezbollah, that with Iranian help, I'm sure, that the Israelis, even Gaza, weren't able to find all of them or destroy all of them, or Hezbollah now is resurgent. So imagine Iran, this massive country where every major city has a massive metro system, much less, I can't imagine how many deep tunnels they must have under all these mountains, and even perhaps, missile production facilities. So it's a quagmire. It's a quagmire that Trump kind of just walked into, or was led into, by the Israelis and his poor advisors and his own poor decision-making. And there's no easy way out. And I think the Iranian calculation is, again, this idea of they need a horizon. Like, for them to come out of this war, if it was just a previous status quo of debilitating sanctions, of a lot of, intervention against the country aimed at regime change, regime collapse, that's not a tenable status quo. If this war can happen again in 6 months. So their goal is to inflict such a level of cost that if the previous scenario was Trump would threaten Iran and the Iranian currency would depreciate, the price of dollar in Iran would go up, the new status quo that they want to force is that if someone threatens Iran, then the oil price will just naturally go up and the markets will take an impact, because this has been a proven ability and this is something that can happen again. And so they're looking for some kind of economic horizon, sanctions relief. Again, it seems very hard to imagine right now that the U.S. can agree to some kind of strategic deal with Iran when they rejected that deal that was arguably better than the Obama deal just 2 weeks ago. But then again, today, Bessent just said that Iran can sell this oil that's at sea. So you never know. I mean, wars ultimately end always in diplomatic deals. The U.S. ultimately left Afghanistan after 20 years, handed it back to the Taliban. They left Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So there's a precedent, obviously, for these kind of strategic setbacks. But we've seen, ultimately in this context where failed U.S. decision-making, policy-making, including in the foreign policy establishment, not 20 years after Iraq and a big strategic catastrophe that was, now we're in what is a big strategic catastrophe. And I think in either scenario, it's going to be a strategic catastrophe. So one scenario is that Trump has no choice, as Barbara said, kind of to de-escalate, try to get a deal, get out of this, where Iran could potentially emerge stronger strategically, despite, but taking severe blows. I don't want to diminish that. Iran has taken severe blows, the economy, the people, and they're going to have a hard time coming back from this in any case. But then the other alternative is that Trump digs in deeper, ground troops in the Strait of Hormuz, tries to take Kharg Island, goes, bombing more infrastructure in Iran. Iran bombs more infrastructure. I think if that plays out long enough, the costs for the global economy are obviously going to get higher, but also Iran may actually move towards falling apart or reach state collapse. But I think if Iran were to fall apart into state collapse, something like Libya, which I would say is not a likely scenario, but it's, if Trump wants to go harder and this war lasts months and months, that is an imaginable scenario. An idea of a destabilized Iranian plateau where it's a very polarized society, fragmented society. Obviously, you have all the supporters of the Islamic Republic and the military and the Basij and IRGC that are still going to be around. That's going to create a lot of instability and perpetuity for the Persian Gulf region. So a lot of these things we're seeing, drone strikes, instabilities, and with this very narrow Strait of Hormuz, this is, if Iran is a black hole, that's arguably just as bad for the Gulf countries and their political economy models and their security models as Iran attacking them. So I think what they need and what the region needs is a stable new equilibrium and balance of power where these powers can all kind of prosper together. Because I think this model of trying to exclude a big country of 90 million people in this very important geostrategic area has had all these costs that is really untenable. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sina, for this. Lots of points, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions as well. Before we move on to our next speaker, I want to remind our audience that you can send in your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom or by email to Arab Center to events@arabcenterdc.org. And we'll try to get to these questions. Now I'd like to move on to Giorgio Cafiero and focusing on the Gulf states. Giorgio, the Gulf states are bearing the brunt of Iranian attacks. There are serious long-term risks to energy markets and their economies. What are the positions of the different countries in the Gulf, and what options do they have at this time? Are there potential long-term impacts of this shift in the regional security architecture, if you will, in their relationships with the United States specifically? Giorgio.
Yeah, thank you so much. So wonderful to be with all of you today. Only wish we had some brighter things to be discussing. When talking about how the GCC states fit into the picture, I think I want to begin by talking about the position of Saudi Arabia. When we are talking about pretty much all of the Saudi foreign policy decisions of the last 5 years or so, these policies need to be understood within the context of Vision 2030, the grandiose plan to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy beyond oil. About a decade ago, the kingdom's leadership unveiled Vision 2030, and now 2030 is actually a year not too far into the future. And in order for the Saudis to succeed with their plans for economic diversification, they really need stability at home as well as stability in the neighborhood. This is essential to attracting the levels of investment that Saudi Arabia needs, to bring in the tourism, to bring in the foreign business. And I think this really helps us understand why, for example, Saudi Arabia decided to let bygones be bygones with Qatar and lift the blockade in early 2021 to reach a truce with the Houthis that remains de facto in effect today in 2022. to reconcile with the former Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, and then also through Chinese, Iraqi, and Omani mediation to renormalize diplomatic relations with Iran, which took place in Beijing 3 years ago. The view in the other 5 GCC states is very much aligned with this vision. They also have their own ambitions for economic development and diversification, which require stability in the neighborhood. It's within this context that all 6 GCC states, despite some of them having very tense histories with Iran, were completely opposed to a US and/or Israeli war on Iran. The GCC states might be the countries in the world that have the most realistic understanding of Iran, other than Iran itself. They understood how easily Iran could disrupt stability in the neighborhood if it came under attack. Let's remember that at the end of the 12-day war in June 2025, Iran did carry out an attack targeting the Al Udeid airbase in Qatar. Of course, that was an attack that was pre-signaled and it was very choreographed. But in the Gulf region, policymakers understood that if the 12-day war would unfreeze and Iran would come under attack again, the Iranians could attack targets in the GCC states with much more intensity and doing it in manners that were not choreographed at all. This is exactly what has happened, and I would actually argue that the Iranian attacks against the GCC states have been far more intense and destructive than officials in the Gulf Arab states had predicted. And the fact that all 6 GCC states, including the Sultanate of Oman, has been targeted really speaks to the extent to which Iran has chosen to lash out so intensely against the Gulf Arab countries that were not a part of the American-Israeli war on Iran that began late last month. It really speaks volumes that Iran has waged more attacks against the United Arab Emirates than against Israel since February 28th. So essentially, the GCC states are now in a very, very serious dilemma. This is a war that they tried very hard to avert. As Sina was mentioning, Oman in particular did everything in its power to try to prevent this war from happening. And the fact that the Omani foreign minister came all the way to Washington, D.C. the day before this conflict broke out to try to prevent it really speaks volumes about everything that Muscat did to try to give diplomacy the best chance possible. Nonetheless, this is a war that is not the GCC states' war, but it is one that they have been brought into because of the ways in which Iran chose to retaliate. At this point, the GCC states really do not have any good options. They are not interested in an escalation with Iran. They also cannot allow these attacks against them to go without any sort of response. But so far, the GCC states, I believe, have been quite cautious and measured in terms of their responses. Their responses, from a military standpoint, so far have been strictly defensive. And there has also been a lot of diplomatic energy that they've put into efforts to try to rally the international community in support of their sovereign rights and to condemn Iran for its attacks on the 6 GCC states. Moving forward, a key question is whether or not the GCC states might wage their own strikes, their counterattacks against Iran. This would be a development that severely escalates tensions in the Gulf. And I think the GCC members do not want to go there. They understand that Iran could still attack the GCC states with more intensity than what we've seen over the past 20 days. And they certainly do not want to see that happen. My understanding is that so far there has only been one desalination plant in the Arabian Peninsula that Iran has targeted. If some members of the GCC are to wage their own strikes against Iran, there could be more desalination plants targeted by the Iranians. It's a whole other discussion to get into, but basically, when desalination plants and the GCC members are under attack, this brings basic questions about human survivability on the Arabian Peninsula into question. This is one of many reasons why the GCC countries do not want to further escalate. However, when Iran is continuing to wage these drone and missile attacks on the GCC states, it is pushing them closer to the point where they think they have no choice but to wage counterattacks against Iran. But at the same time, I think if the GCC states would choose to wage these counterattacks against Iran, they would want to do so in very close coordination with the United States. However, at this point, the GCC states have basically no reason to see the United States as a reliable ally. And this war in of itself really speaks to the extent to which the United States has failed to be a credible security guarantor for the GCC countries. And this leaves the 6 members of the GCC in a very difficult situation where their threat perceptions of Iran have been very much reinforced and validated by everything that's happened over the past 20 days. But they also have no confidence in the United States to protect them from the Iranians. And therefore, what began a while ago, which was the growing doubt about the United States as a serious security umbrella, is just being reinforced. But this did not begin with this conflict. Going back years, arguably decades, I would say really to 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, the GCC states have begun to see the US as a power that in many ways brings more instability rather than stability to the neighborhood. And then fast forward to 2019, in May of that year, there were acts of sabotage off the UAE's coast, which were linked to Iran. And then September that year, the Aramco attacks. And then in early 2022, the Houthi attacks on Abu Dhabi. All of those episodes underscored how the United States had failed to protect the GCC countries from external threats. Now, in light of everything that's happened since February 28, with the Gulf very much being on fire, as one Kuwaiti scholar told me, the term security guarantor is one that people in the GCC can no longer even associate with the United States. So the GCC states are extremely vulnerable at this point. And this raises very difficult questions about how they are going to navigate the road ahead when the dust eventually settles. There is an understanding in the Gulf that what we are going to see in Iran, perhaps what we could describe, as the analyst Hussein Ibish put it, an Islamic Republic 2.0, with now the Islamic Republic's 3rd supreme leader at the helm, Iranian regime that is more radical, that is more aggressive, and will be more difficult for GCC states to engage. And there are other scenarios that the GCC states have to consider, which Sina touched upon a few minutes ago. The possibility of the Iranian nation state collapsing is probably the worst case scenario from the Gulf Arab states' perspective. If there are huge power vacuums in Iran, we could see massive amounts of weaponry moving across international borders. We could see violent and extreme non-state actors taking advantage of the chaos. There would be huge spillover effects into all neighboring countries, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and certainly the GCC states as well. That's a scenario that they certainly do not want. I think most likely what stands as the most likely scenario moving forward, and this is one that definitely terrifies the GCC states, is that the costs of this war will become so high for the US that Trump decides to essentially declare a victory, and then the US basically in one form or another stops its intervention. But Iran is determined to continue making sure that the United States pays a very high price for its decision to attack Iran. And a way they do this is by continuing to attack US interests in the GCC states. And so we sort of have a low intensity sustained campaign of aggression against GCC states. Maybe missiles and drones will fly in, but at less frequency than what we've seen since late last month. Maybe cyber attacks against the GCC states. And this would basically leave the GCC states with the impression that the United States began a reckless war of choice and then decided to pull out and leave the Gulf Arab states responsible for dealing with the mess. And this could go on for many, many years. I will end by making the point that such a scenario poses a huge threat to Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and all the other visions of the 5 other GCC states. If this is the case, it will be very difficult to imagine these states succeeding in terms of growing their tourism industries. It will pose an enormous threat to the future of the Gulf's aviation ecosystem. Remember, Trump went to 3 GCC states in May of last year, hundreds of billions of dollars signed in various sectors such as AI. These very ambitious plans for data centers in the Gulf countries will not be able to go forward. The ability of these GCC states to attract massive amounts of foreign direct investment going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for these plans to move forward. And at the end of the day, if the Gulf Arab states are not able to diversify their economies beyond oil and natural gas, that's going to lead to an eventual economic crash at some point down the road. So it's very difficult for me to overstate how horrible the current situation is for all 6 GCC states. This was a war that they strongly advised against. They did everything they could to prevent it. Trump did not listen to his friends in the Gulf who had the wisdom to understand how bombing Iran would play out. He chose to listen to Netanyahu. Unfortunate for the Gulf Arab states, though, they are paying the price for this absolutely unnecessary and completely reckless war that Trump believed would be a good decision to start.
Thank you, Giorgio, for this comprehensive overview of the view from the GCC. We have a few questions that we'll get to. The first questions I want to pose for all of you, and maybe we'll start with Barbara, is about the Trump administration. Giorgio, you mentioned that Trump has important deals with the GCC states, and that he did not listen to the U.S. allies in terms of this war. And Sina mentioned the influence of Kushner and Witkoff as well. I want to ask you, Barbara, who has Trump's ear the most in this administration? Who is most influential and who's influencing Trump's decisions as far as you can tell?
Yeah, I think when Trump came in, a lot of us thought there would be a competition between the Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, and the Israelis as to who would influence Trump's decisions on the Middle East. And when he went to Saudi Arabia and the GCC on his first trip, that kind of raised some some optimism that he might actually listen to the GCC countries more than he would listen necessarily to Netanyahu. But I think something shifted in him, and this may be because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, and so he decided that he would go to war, or because he was lulled by the apparent success of the June strikes, when the US was barely involved, but did significant damage to Iran's nuclear installations, and then the Venezuela raid. And so he was puffed up with self-confidence and convinced that he could do this too, that he, Donald Trump, this would be when this terrible regime that had been a bête noire of the United States for nearly half a century, it would fall on Donald Trump's watch. I think that was his estimation, to the extent that we can really get inside his head. So I don't know. I mean, he's a volatile man. He may easily now turn on those who persuaded him to go into this war, although that is difficult. And it's made more difficult by the fact that he has not employed traditional U.S. diplomats that he's used personal friends and family members, almost like he's, not an American president at all, but a monarch. And I read somewhere that Witkoff actually carried with him one of the pagers or a replica of a pager that Israel used to kill Hezbollah leaders, to booby trap Hezbollah pagers back, a year or so ago. And this obviously shows where Witkoff's sympathies lie. And of course, we know about Jared Kushner and the influence that he had on Trump in the first term to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights. So it is fair to say that this war was very much something that Israel and pro-Bibi individuals are in Donald Trump's orbit pushed for him to do. Now the question is, how does he get out of it? And I think that's what we're all struggling to see, because he has the ability to do a 180 and act as though nothing strange has happened. But it's difficult when the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively blocked, when we're losing interlocutors in Iran like Ali Larijani, who might be able to negotiate an off-ramp. Who is going to step forward to try to help find a way out of this mess? That is still the question.
Thank you, Barbara. And, we've talked about the assassinations of leaders, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, or in Iran. And we've seen that this does not accomplish the elimination of the group or the regime. In some cases, as Sina noted, that they're being replaced by more radical and more aggressive figures. In this case, I want to turn to Yusuf. You mentioned, Yusuf, a little bit about Israel's end game and its goal to establish hegemony in the region. And I want to get your input on this, the goal of these targeted assassinations of leaders, and what is Israel expecting out of this. But also we have a question about Lebanon and Israel's end game in Lebanon. We haven't talked about Lebanon. And, this war comes in the middle of a heated discussions that have been taking place about disarmament. Israel has essentially ordered evacuations all the way, south of the Litani River, even beyond that. What is Israel's end game in Lebanon, Yusuf? And feel free to answer the previous question as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of the assassinations, the Israelis have proven, along with the Americans, that they can operate with a great degree of freedom over the skies of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and now Iran to a great extent. And I think they are using these capabilities in their view to try to create the outcome that they want to see on the ground, which is regime change. Now, it's very hard to direct a regime change operation with airstrikes. But it seems that the approach that they're taking is that if they can continually eliminate and weaken Iranian regime leadership and the critical nodes of the repression apparatus in Iran, that they can kind of plow the road towards that outcome. Now, exactly where it goes from there, nobody can really tell, because at the end of the day, it requires an on-the-ground component, and it requires people actually being involved in shaping the direction of Iran's future. But we have not even got to that point yet. And I think, there are so many examples going back historically of these sort of leadership decapitations, which only seem to temporarily set the clock back before the inevitable sort of repeats itself. A very good example is what we're witnessing today in Lebanon. A few months ago, the Israelis were talking fairly confidently that they had effectively defeated Hezbollah, they had changed the paradigm in Lebanon, and I think among the most shocked by the response from Hezbollah in the opening days of this war were the Israelis themselves, who were not prepared for the kind of capabilities that Hezbollah was still able to demonstrate. What's the end game in Lebanon? I'm not sure that there's a very clear end game. The Israeli strategy for now seems to be very much what was the strategy that it had articulated for many years in dealing with Gaza, which was essentially what they called mowing the lawn. Over a period of time, the grass would grow and they would be forced to mow it again. Of course, by mowing, they mean bombing it, right? But the lawn is no longer just in Gaza. Now it's across the entire region. This is the only strategy that seems to be in play. And because they believe they have the capabilities and cover to be able to continue to do this, this is where they seem to be gravitating towards.
Thank you, Yusuf, for this. We have a couple of questions about the Gulf states. So I'll move to Georgia now, and also anybody else, please feel free to chime in as well. One question is about the Abraham Accords. What does this do to the Abraham Accords? The second questions we have from another audience member is about the reporting in the Washington Post that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, has been privately pushing Trump for this war. Does Saudi Arabia benefit from regime change in Iran? Georgia, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, regarding the Washington Post reporting, no, I don't believe that Mohammed bin Salman was pushing Trump to wage this war. I think going beyond just the Washington Post report, there's been a tremendous amount of Israeli as well as Iranian disinformation that misrepresents the positions of the GCC states in regards to this war. I think that there is an effort now that the war is not going very well to try to shift some of the blame to GCC states and take some of the blame away from Israel. Just an example of this, Rachel Maddow alleged that Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia bribed Trump into bombing Iran. She did not mention Israeli responsibility for Trump's decision to wage this war. So again, there is an effort to try to shift the blame to the GCC states. But anyone who has an understanding of the interests of the GCC states knows that this war with Iran was really the last thing that they wanted. This is not to say that there was much love for the Islamic Republic in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, or these other Gulf Arab capitals, but they understood how bombing of Iran would quickly destabilize the Gulf region. And the Qataris, I think, in light of everything that's happened the past 24, 36 hours, have really felt a tremendous amount of pain as a consequence of this conflict spilling into their territory. Excuse me. The next question that was asked was about the Abraham Accords. I don't think that as a consequence of this ongoing war, either of the two GCC states in the Abraham Accords, UAE and Bahrain, are going to abrogate their normalization deals with Israel, nor do I think any of the 4 GCC states that did not join the Abraham Accords will join because of this conflict. I think the genocide in Gaza beginning in 2023 did a lot to basically freeze the expansion of the Abraham Accords, because that conflict in Gaza, that genocide in Gaza, made any discussion of Arab-Israeli normalization extremely toxic throughout the wider Arab world, and the political risks of normalizing relations with Tel Aviv amid the genocide were simply too high. Now, how do I think this war impacts the Abraham Accords? Well, I think it severely undermines the narrative that was pushed by the United States under Trump 1.0, Biden, and also Trump 2.0, and as well as a narrative pushed by the UAE and Israel that the Abraham Accords were going to lead to peace in the Middle East. I think at this point, it's extremely clear that Arab states normalizing with Israel has done absolutely nothing to bring more peace or stability to the region. So I think it will be even harder for advocates of Arab-Israeli normalization to make that case going forward.
Thank you, Giorgio. I'll move on to Sina and the question about the long-term durability of the Iranian regime. You've mentioned that Iran has leverage in terms of controlling energy markets and that they've been preparing for this war. But until when and at what cost? And if you could speak a little bit about what the Iranian people have been, how they've been reacting to this. We don't know very much, and that's something that we're aware of. But what is your assessment of, a couple of people mentioned that Netanyahu has been advocating for regime change and expecting mass protests and defections in Iran. What is the reaction by the Iranian people?
Yes, well, I would say that the biggest threat to the Islamic Republic's grip on power ultimately comes not from the outside, even from this war, but from the inside, internally within the country, in this context where it has shed a lot of the legitimacy for decades, that this was a government that came to power in 1979 on the heels of a popular revolution, and cemented itself in a conflict in the Iran-Iraq war. And in the 1980s, it was a very radical period of consolidation of power by the Islamic Republic and its proponents, and the marginalization and violent repression of other political forces. And since then, we've seen this government very much be intransigent when it comes to kind of major domestic political reforms. Its kind of branches of government are very insular by and large. I mean, they're within the camp of the Islamic Republic and the tent of the Islamic Republic and its politics, there is a diverse array of opinions, but that has been narrowing in the over several decades, especially, the reformist camp has been greatly weakened. They were unable to usher in major kind of political and structural reforms. But with that said, I mean, we are in a context where, there is a lot of deep-seated discontent in Iran. The society, I have argued, is very polarized. It's not that, it's necessarily like 90% one way, 10% the other way, or something like that. I mean, the Islamic Republic has a base. Again, it's hard to measure because we don't necessarily have a lot of good empirical data, but there are public opinion polls that have been done, including by Western institutions, however imperfect they may be in that context. There are election data we can look at for Iran. For example, the last election that Pezeshkian came to power, which was a snap election after Raisi was killed died in a plane and helicopter accident. There was 50% turnout, and in the first round of that election, it was about 40%. It was a historic low. And Pezeshkian won. He was a reformist, but he was a reformist that, unlike, what Khatami set out to do in 1997 as a reformist president then, or unlike what Rouhani set out to do in 2013 with a much bigger mandate and turnout, was to really challenge the entrenched power centers of the Islamic Republic. Pezeshkian really came to power as a kind of very docile reformist who was very much kind of a yes man for Khamenei. So it still occurred in this broader context of kind of the hardline or consolidation of power, and he was kind of a nominal reformist figurehead who ultimately hasn't had that much power, although he's not powerless either. But we've seen that, Iran has had these protest movements every couple of years that have increased really since 2018. When US sanctions came back, they intensified. The middle class has shrunk since then dramatically. By some estimates, 10 to 50 million more Iranians have dropped from the middle class to poverty just since 2018. And the opposition, meanwhile, Iran has long had a homegrown domestic opposition, grassroots activists, people, independent unions, civil society activists, ex-officials who've become dissidents themselves, like, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who led the Green Movement in 2009. Figures like Mostafa Tajzadeh, for example, was a former deputy interior minister who is a dissident and a political prisoner now. And, these are people who've long been against both foreign intervention and military intervention, but also the authoritarianism within Iran and within the Islamic Republic. Theirs is a voice we don't hear as much, but they've been active all throughout the years. They're the ones, they've had capacity for domestic mobilization for many years. Regardless, what we have been seeing since 2018 in this context of deepening economic crisis and impoverishment, where we have these waves of protests that are then brutally crushed. So in November 2019, you had the fuel price hike that resulted in countrywide protests that were brutally crushed. Something like 300 to 400 people were killed then, according to Amnesty International and other human rights groups based abroad. Then you had the Women Life Freedom Movement in 2022, triggered by the death in custody of an Iranian Kurdish woman named Mahsa Jina Amini. And that movement was very striking for being very inclusive and much more crossing ethnic and political, traditional ethnic and political divides in Iran. And that movement really ultimately led to the end of mandatory hijab, not on paper necessarily. I mean, although on paper, like Pezeshkian prevented a new bill that would enforce mandatory hijab from being enacted early in his term. Hardliners have had a whack-a-mole approach, to mandatory hijab enforcement, but by most accounts, since in the wake of that 2022 Women Life Freedom Movement, that was crushed, and among the demands were beyond just mandatory hijab, people who've wanted fundamental political change for many years. But nevertheless, mandatory hijab was, in big cities, according to estimates I've heard from European officials and, embassies on the ground, something to like 30 to 40% of women in like Tehran were going out without hijab, just, in the last fall, for example. And so the January protests that just happened a month ago before these protests, before this war, were another big inflection point where they were triggered by the depreciating currency. You had about for 2 weeks, the protests spread in certain parts of Iran, mostly in the provinces, in southern Iran and western Iran. Then you had for the first time an exile opposition figure, namely Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, who was toppled in 1979. He issued a call for people to take to the streets on January 8th and 9th. And for the first time, people came to the streets in sizable numbers. And I have argued and continue to argue that this wasn't necessarily a support for monarchism or kind of reestablishing, that kind of government, but, he's a placeholder for a lot of rage and anger and desperation that Iranians have seen that I would argue is actually shed since then. But in any case, people came to the streets in big numbers January 8th and 9th, and they were met with a very brutal massacre, arguably the worst massacre that the Iranian government has inflicted. According to outside estimates that have documented names like Harana, which is a group based in America that has rigorous documentation and verification efforts, they've documented about 7,000 people who were killed in those protests, including about several hundred security forces, other people, but mostly protesters, the vast majority protesters. And so this is in this context that I would argue of authoritarian clampdown, more severe repression, that if you look at the academic literature in these contexts of a state being targeted with this kind of pressure, isolation, maximum pressure, sanctions, that middle class is being debilitated, it actually does not lead to democratic transition or really create the conditions conducive for democratic transition. You have more desperate protests that are less organized, more incoherent, which I would argue is held in Iran, much more brutal crackdowns. And all that has held up in Iran. Really, a lot of the research and scholarship on these kind of protest movements of these authoritarian contexts is really held up. Same in, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, where these kind of economic pressures don't lead to democratic change. But, we saw that with the protest movement, that Trump used that as a pretext for this war, arguably. I mean, he said at the time that help is on the way. Reza Pahlavi himself had basically tried to create the conditions for more violence because he called on people to take to the city centers, take the city centers. Trump called on people to take the buildings, take the institutions. So you saw a lot of people get killed. And then, that creating the pretext for this kind of intervention, even under the guise of like a humanitarian intervention, which some people have argued for. But as we're seeing that, Trump is just exploiting these issues, these grievances of the Iranians, as are the Israelis. And Trump in the first 2 weeks of this war has gone from like supporting, Kurds attacking Iran, which, that unifies a lot of Iranians against threats to the territorial integrity of the country. It's, the challenge of separatism. We've seen Trump say, it's okay. He wanted to say in who becomes the next supreme leader. He said it could be, religious leader. It doesn't matter. Democracy doesn't matter. So, I mean, it's become very blatant that obviously the Iranian people and their legitimate grievances and their quest and struggle that is over a century long for democratic governance was not part of the calculation for this war. And, now civilian sites have been hit.
Thank you, Sina.
Yeah. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for all of that. Very insightful. We are out of time, but I want to give our other three panelists the chance to give concluding remarks. And I'll throw just a couple of questions. Feel free to answer any of them or give your own concluding remarks. A question from an audience member. Could the Gulf countries have done anything to dissuade Trump? We know that there have been attempts, but was there any chance of the Gulf countries dissuading Trump from attacking Iran? In terms of the $200 billion that the Pentagon requested for the war, will this have to go to Congress? What if Congress does not authorize the amount? What would the Trump administration do? And one more question about the extent of Israeli actions in Lebanon and Syria and the occupied territories. How is this explained by the Greater Israel Strategy? I'll give Yusuf, Giorgio, and Barbara just maybe a few seconds to make your final comments. Let's start with Yusuf.
Yeah, I will just say very, very briefly two things that are yet to be determined once this all ends and are going to be major, major questions. The first is around the Strait of Hormuz. At this time, it seems like Iran has demonstrated that it can turn the screw on the Strait of Hormuz anytime it wants without requiring super advanced capabilities to do so. And it doesn't seem like that could be changed without some kind of major presence on the ground. I don't think the United States has the appetite for doing that, nor do I think it can necessarily tolerate the precedent being set that Iran has the capabilities to do that moving forward. So what is going to happen there is a big question. Second, in terms of the Gulf countries, despite investing a tremendous amount of money in the United States, in the Trump administration in particular, and hosting American bases, they were really treated here as the second fiddle, and are paying the costs most heavily of all American allies in the region. There is going to be some sort of significant reevaluation around security policy once all of this ends.
Okay, and with the Gulf, we move on to Giorgio.
Yeah, thank you so much for this event today. I think obviously when we're talking about the GCC, we're talking about 6 different countries. They don't always make the same types of foreign policy decisions. And I think the ways in which these 6 different states move ahead vis-a-vis the United States might not necessarily be the same. I think there is certainly a possibility that as a consequence of Iran's hostilities toward the Gulf, some might actually consider the benefits of doubling down on their alliances with the United States and trying to seek stronger guarantees from Washington. I do think perhaps in some other GCC states, there will be efforts to become more autonomous from the United States, to put more limits on relationships with Washington, to try to diversify by looking to other countries, Turkey, China, Russia, perhaps France. I don't think any one of those countries on their own could replace the United States as a security guarantor in the Gulf, nor do I think they would necessarily have an interest in trying to do so. But I think there's going to be an acceleration of this movement toward diversified relationships. I think longer term, on a global level, probably a consequence of this war is going to be a Gulf subregion that is more Asia, specifically China oriented, and less oriented toward the West. But that is a change that started a while ago, I think really bringing us back to the 2008-2009 financial crash. I just think this war is another event that is going to accelerate that movement, sort of pushing the world's center of geopolitical and geoeconomic gravity toward Asia. Long term, I think there's a very good chance that that's going to be an outcome of this conflict.
Thank you, Giorgio. And finally, Barbara, and maybe the question about the 200 billion, but also, I mean, we've been hearing some Israeli officials trying to push this narrative that Turkey is the new Iran and Qatar is the new Turkey, and trying to push the US into more wars. Where does this end?
Yeah, well, I won't even begin to answer the second question. On the 200 billion, I think there'll be quite a bit of resistance in Congress for appropriating yet more money. Pentagon already has a record budget. And some of the people who voted against legislation that would have stopped the war have made it very clear that if it goes on for more than 5 or 6 weeks, they may want to revisit those votes. So Congress has been very supine, to put it mildly, but I think we may begin to see more resistance in Congress to this war if it doesn't end soon.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to all of you, our speakers, for your time and for your excellent analyses. On behalf of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., I also like to thank our audience for tuning in, and very, very insightful and rich discussion. The video will be available on our website at arabcenterdc.org. I also want to invite all of you to join our 11th annual conference taking place on April 9th, both in person at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and online via Zoom, focusing on Trump's second term policies and their impacts on democracy, development, and diplomacy, both here in the United States and in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Take care, everyone.